Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on China fall recruitment, managing the Delta variant, demographic shifts, and new tutoring regulations. It's my pleasure to speak to all of you today. My name is David Weeks. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Sunrise International. I'll be our moderator for today. We're just at the top of the hour here at 2 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. I see some people trickling in to the webinar already. We'll go ahead and do first a round of self-introductions, and then we'll jump into the content of the webinar. If you have any questions at all as we present, do feel free to use the Q&A tool. It's a little bit easier for us to keep track of questions as they come in if we all use the Q&A tool rather than chat. So we'd ask that unless you have sort of a direct message for one of us to go ahead and use the Q&A tool. Webinar will be recorded and sent to everyone who signed up for the webinar. If you have any colleagues or any sort of other interested parties who would like a copy, then you can also feel free to write to us over email. Our emails are up here on the slides, and we can get that sent to you as well. Why don't we go ahead and start with introductions? Jorge, do you want to get us kicked off?
Sure, thank you, David. My name is Jorge Calderon. I'm the Assistant Director for International Student Enrollment at Iowa State University Office of Admissions. My main role is leading the recruitment for international undergrad, but also my team contributes a little bit to the recruitment of international graduate students as well. I serve on the board of Study Iowa as the president, and I'm also on the IDP US Advisory Council.
Fantastic. Lawrence, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hello, my name is Lawrence Murray, and I'm the Dean of Admissions here at the Cabelli School of Business at Fordham University in New York City. My role is to manage the strategic enrollment management for all of, we have about 20 graduate programs in the graduate division here at the business school. So my teams manage the admissions and recruitment across a portfolio of about 20 graduate business academic programs.
Thank you both. And definitely carrying the crucible of having the most awkward time to join us today is my colleague, Shan Liu, who joins us from Beijing at 2:02 a.m. local time. Shan, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, my name is Shan, and I'm the digital director at Sunrise. So over the past years, we've worked with over 200 universities from US, UK, Turkey, Canada to try to help them build the brand awareness in China and improve the digital presence in China.
Fantastic. I'm also joined here on the webinar by my colleague Keating Sherry. He's the person in the shadows. He'll be helping us to moderate Q&A and also to post in some links that we'll be sharing later on that might be useful resources. But in case you were wondering. For our agenda today and a little bit about Sunrise as the host. Sunrise, as Shan alluded to, we are a company that helps out universities in engaging the Chinese market, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. Our headquarters is in Beijing. We have a good number of colleagues based in the US, and we work with universities around the world, primarily organizing recruitment tours, recruitment events, both virtual and offline. Posting white papers and sharing market research for universities that find that useful, and helping universities to localize their digital presence, be that through digital campaigns, localized websites, SEO, as well as a variety of different social media platforms, from the ones you might be more familiar with, like WeChat, to more emerging platforms like Douyin and Bilibili. So to get us started off, or to frame the questions we'll be talking about, we have two main sort of discussion blocks that we wanted to explore today. The first is to offer a little bit of an update on what's happening in China with the Delta variant. In particular, the Delta variant is looming over fall recruitment for many US universities as well as those from outside. We expect that this will continue to contribute to sporadic lockdowns in China. So we'd like to explore what that means for recruitment. What in-person options exist for universities, and how can we create better, more engaging virtual or hybrid events, be those in a DIY context, those that your university might be putting on directly, or some different criteria or ways that you might think about possible third-party vendors who are offering virtual events or online activities to engage students. The next sort of main discussion item is new regulations that have come out in China and what they mean. In particular, there are two big laws that we saw recently. One that regulated the private tutoring space, which is going to have some impacts on some of the larger agencies in China, as well as some new regulations that will make it, we expect, slightly harder to open a new private school, and in particular, new private K-12 schools. So exploring what that means. We won't bore you too much with the sort of nuts and bolts of the law, although I certainly invite you to read our white paper if you find that boring stuff to be interesting. Instead, we'll kind of pan out from that and explore what this means in a broader context, in particular because these regulations have some, I'd say, discernible implications in terms of further separating, creating more space between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities. So talking about what it means that these laws might be extenuating or accentuating these regional differences in China, as well as what it might mean to see a more fragmented private sector recruitment space, or if we have less centralization among the largest agencies that you might see at international conferences like NAFSA, for instance. Finally, we'll provide some recommendations and then move on to Q&A. For each of these sections, I'll give basically a data dump of about 5 minutes, just offering context and updates that will help frame a discussion. We'll aim for about 20 minutes of discussion for Delta variant and about 15 minutes of discussion for the implications of some of the new laws that we've seen in China and trying to extrapolate what that might mean for different university contexts. So let's dive right into it. So in order to assess the impact of the Delta variant, I'd say that the easiest thing we can generalize is that fall 2021 might look an awful lot like fall 2020. Students in China are expected to be in school together offline, but physical events are going to be limited, and we expect that many events will either be virtual or will be a sort of soft hybrid, where there will be a minority of participants attending physically and the majority of university attendants participating virtually. We expect that as it stands right now, most universities and nearly all high schools in China are offline. Some of them delayed their offline start dates. But at this point, after the sort of initial outbreak of the Delta variant in August, most schools have reverted back to offline. There is a lot of concern about case counts in the US, and that is certainly being refracted through Chinese traditional and social media. In comparison to last year, there's probably less concern about visas for students, both because of more favorable policies from the Biden administration, as well as a sort of, a better pandemic situation in China as compared to the US. But getting to China for recruiters will remain a challenge, we expect. However, we have one other big difference with the fall of 2020, which is that we now have a full cycle of pandemic recruitment behind us. Hopefully we have a better idea and a better sense of what works and where there's room for improvement. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Here are some discussion questions, but there's a couple of other important points that we should actually go over. Let me go ahead and cycle over to those briefly. Yes, sorry about that. So in China, we're seeing a more intense, this is probably in the last couple of months, we're seeing a more intense response than in past outbreaks. So when the Delta variant first emerged in late July and August in China, we saw many flights from foreign countries as well as domestic flights get canceled. There were partial lockdowns in several cities. Foreign arrivals were significantly curtailed. Even Chinese citizens who were trying to get their passport issued or renewed experienced significant difficulty. The language that we saw from the government actually reflected a sort of crisis management situation. In comparison to last May and in early June, where there was really a window of opportunity, a small opening where it was possible to get to China as a non-Chinese citizen for recruitment travel if you were able to get a lot of paperwork together, in particular this thing called a PU letter, which allows you to apply for a visa. There was a window of opportunity late in the spring and early in the summer. That window of opportunity really has closed now, and it's harder than it's ever been to get a visa to come to China. Like I said, most schools have started online, but have quickly shifted back to offline. So that means that for college fairs, we're expecting a mix of some offline fairs and some hybrid events. One thing to note, though, is that even though schools are offline, they're teaching classes face-to-face. That doesn't mean that their school gates are as open as they were in 2019. In fact, a great number of restrictions do exist on outside visitors. So for our poor college counselors or student activities coordinators in universities, that means that it is going to be quite difficult to persuade school administrations to allow a really large-scale gathering on campus like those that we saw in 2019. So I really doubt that we're going to see 200 universities attending a massive fair in Shanghai or in Beijing anytime soon if that's hosted on campus. You're more likely to see smaller scale fairs or those that have sort of safety or capacity limitations imposed. You can also expect that if you want to sign up for a fair and you happen to have an in-country rep handy or an alumni that you would trust to represent you at a fair, it's probably more likely that you're going to have to register farther in advance because the school will need to make sure that you have your vaccination or your sort of green health QR code, which is sort of the way that vaccination or healthcare status is checked in China. So expect greater vetting, the need to sign up a little bit earlier, and the very real possibility that dates may change or that events may get rescheduled. In terms of when things might get better, we're pretty pessimistic about the possibility of international travel into China in 2021. This is a pretty big shift from earlier in the summer where there were PU letters getting issued. People were coming to China. There was a 3-week quarantine period, which was no fun because it was in a hotel. I would not personally take that request lightly, but it was possible for those who are really dedicated, driven, or for those who had personal or family matters, a family visit to do in China or something like that over the holidays, or for universities who were interested in sending one of their staff members to China for 6 or even 8 weeks. We were sort of joking that it's almost like studying abroad in China because given a 3-week quarantine, it's really worthwhile to stay there for a bit of a longer trip. That, however, that was sort of the world that we saw in May and in June. In large part, those windows have closed. We'd say that the major sort of inflection points or windows where this may change is probably the end of the Winter Olympics at the end of February of 2022, or the introduction of an mRNA vaccine in China. China is in advanced discussions with a couple of pharma companies. So if China licenses or outright purchases or approves the Pfizer vaccine, which is more effective against the Delta variant in comparison to the Chinese vaccines, which are generally viral vector vaccines, where there are a lot of concerns about breakthrough infections and hospitalizations resulting from those breakthrough infections. Those two moments, the end of the Winter Olympics and mRNA vaccines, those are probably the most likely scenarios or points where these visa policies may get seriously reevaluated. So if you're looking for sort of obviously it's really hard to predict these things, but if you're looking for an inflection point or a moment when it's really worth taking a second look at this, those are the two moments that we think you should have your eye on. Given that, we think it's pretty unlikely that China's visa policies are going to get significantly lifted or relaxed until March of 2022. Although the sort of massive rollout of an mRNA vaccine could conceively happen faster. But March 2022 is what a lot of our friends in different HR departments in large Chinese companies are saying as the sort of the most likely possibility and scenario at this point. So as far as our discussion questions. So first, what lessons did your institution draw from recruitment in 2020 and last spring that you plan to carry forward into this new recruitment year? Put differently, based on the lessons we picked up in the pandemic so far, if you had to give a university planning recruitment amid the Delta variant 2 pieces of advice, one thing to do, one thing not to do, perhaps for someone who's newer in their role, what would those two things be?
I'll get it started. um, in terms of lessons learned in 2020, I think the biggest one that we experienced was getting lost in the crowd in these virtual events where in some cases you have several hundreds, 200 or close to 300 institutions participating. Some of those events we saw 0 to maybe a handful of visitors. And the few visitors that entered our booth had a very limited meaningful connection. It was more of a one-way conversation. It definitely felt like we were not connecting with them the same way we would if we were at an in-person event. So I think that's a big thing that we learned. Something else is we had to take a step back and learn that we needed to listen and try to identify maybe what it was that Iowa State was missing in putting programs together and making these opportunities or connecting with students. So we ran a contest late last year in 2020 where we had teams from schools from 9 different countries, heavy representation from China, participate. The contest was having these teams propose the best college recruitment experience for them in their situation in their country. And we learned a lot from that contest. It was a very interesting experiment. We learned, for example, that from parents, because some of the parents were participated and in their projects and so forth. We learned from them that, especially in cities outside of Tier 1 cities, the parents do not speak English and they want to be a part of that journey. They want to read the content and learn about that university. And our website is only in English, of course. We learned from students and parents that they're getting a lot of their official information from official WeChat accounts, not just a WeChat account, but an official WeChat account. And we learned from students that they are getting and learning about opportunities at different institutions across multiple platforms on social media, which you would think, well, we know that, right? We know that kids are on social media, but we were trying to reach them over email and you know, in the more traditional, through the more traditional channels, and not really present on all these other platforms that you mentioned, right? Douyin, Bilibili, and Weibo. So those, I think those are the 2 biggest lessons that we learned. And the second one is specific to China, of course. And then you also said, if we had 2 pieces of advice, right, to do and not to do. The to-do advice would be, if you can get a person on the ground in China, get a person on the ground in China. We did that this year. We just started with someone on the ground a month and a half ago for the very first time. And we had already added a person for the very first time in India a year ago in the midst of COVID in July in the first wave, right? July 2020. So we did see in 2020 that there were very few virtual events taking place in China compared to other places in the world, where, you know, in India there's an event every day, almost every week. And we did not see that in China. We still saw significant number of events taking place in person, and we were not there. So right now, this fall, we're registered to participate in 45 event days in China with our rep that is there, which in any other year, that would have been, I mean, we would not even be doing 45 days in the full year in China. And so the reach that we have right now with just one person there is a big advantage. And the not to do suggestion or advice would be to not wait until COVID disappears to make plans to invest more, do more, travel, get there. We know that it's difficult to get to China, but speaking of the world really in general, our strategy at Iowa State is we are signing up to participate in everything or almost everything that is taking place in person, including China. And some of these events are being canceled. Some of those are being postponed or delayed. And when they are, we just tick them off and keep moving forward. But some of them are expected to take place in person, and we're going to be there in China and outside. And I think that's going to give us an edge, being one of the few U.S. institutions that are participating in some of these events in person around the world.
Well, thanks so much, Jorge. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true that universities that have some form of boots on the ground, either card-carrying representatives or a lot of faith in maybe a small group of particularly trusted alumni, particularly at the undergraduate level, where students feel like there's a little bit more of an open-endedness to what their next step is going to be. That's really important, and I think we hope gives you guys an advantage. But I would love to hear from Lawrence as well. Lawrence, I suppose being with a particular unit inside of a university, this particular question may come off a bit differently. So, were there any particular lessons that you picked up during the pandemic that you plan to plan to bring into 2022, either at the sort of tactical level of do this in this particular way, or at the broader sort of strategic level of engage in country reps or engage alumni to rep you at fairs or something like that? What would be your sort of big do's and don'ts for our audience?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons learned is that COVID actually forced us to sort of rethink our outreach strategies just in general, and I think many schools just tried to replicate their in-person activities and just tried to replicate them online. And I think you have to have that mindset of being digital first. We were forced to be digital first rather than just transposing a sort of in-person framework onto a virtual framework. So one lesson that we've learned that we will carry forward, while I'm not advocating that we will replace all of our in-person events with virtual events, we have to be more digital first. And so we will continue with a broad and expansive virtual footprint. We were able to double, almost triple our points of contact that we'd have in any given non-COVID year. So for us, that was a good thing. So we are right now putting the finishing touches on our outreach strategy for the upcoming year. And we will, when appropriate, do some in-person things, small group in-person things, but the majority of our outreach and engagement will still be virtual. The other lesson that we've learned here is, again, like it can't just be virtual. It can't just be a Zoom and talking heads. And so you've got to find ways to be very dynamic and interactive in your virtual engagement. So for us, that meant engaging more faculty, more current students, and more alumni. And we actually, we sort of turned our stuff on its head and actually did more interactive engagements. Now, we're a business school, although we get 6,000 applications a year across all of our graduate programs, so that's actually quite big. We are a unit within the university, so it's still small scale enough, or at least small enough, that we have the ability to do very engaging and interactive activities. So we tried our best to do interactive workshops and seminars, nothing too overly burdensome for the students, but I found that it actually gave the students the opportunity to have a little bit more skin in the game, and then they actually walked away with something. Instead of just listening, they were active participants in the activities, and I think that was more impactful for them, and they walked away with something other than, hey, I just sat in and passively listened to a bunch of talking heads. So one other thing that we learned, to over communicate is better than to under communicate. And even though last year things were rapidly changing, this was the bane of my existence, was sending messages to students and our admitted, in particular our admitted students, because everything was changing so frequently. Are the classes going to be in person or online? Is it hybrid or not hybrid? Are you going to require a vaccine, not require a vaccine? Are there exemptions? All of these things. So, we learned the hard way that to over communicate is actually better than to under communicate. And so how does that translate moving forward? We really overhauled our admitted student portals for our programs, and we put a lot more information. We eliminated nearly all of our email that we were sending students in that admitted student phase, and converted all of that content into content that was on our admitted student portals. And obviously we saw a significant increase in traffic on our admitted student portal. So that was good. Okay, so things not to do. Definitely don't hold back information. I think what we did was, things were changing so quickly, and we decided, hey, we're gonna space out these sort of mass communications where we're giving updates to tell people what's going on. And that didn't go well. That just caused people to be even more anxious, and it caused our phones to blow up, as well as our sort of general inbox to blow up with lots of questions. We also armed our ambassadors. We actually had about 10 hours worth of training with the ambassadors on how to crisis communication, sort of a version of crisis communication. And we deployed those ambassadors to help us disseminate important information about what was going on. For the university, our way out of COVID was branded Fordham Forward. And then at the business school, we branded our sort of moving through COVID as Gabelli Forward. And, there were lots of things like that we talked about, our investment in instructional designers to help us redesign our curriculum. We made a commitment to the students that we were investing in technology, investing in support for faculty, so they wouldn't just get a series of PowerPoints that someone's talking over as a replacement for in person. We actually invested a lot of time and a lot of money to train up our faculty members so that they felt extremely comfortable in the virtual space. And we redesigned the classes so that it actually fit this modality of being virtual. So that's one of the things that I would share with you.
Well, thanks, Lawrence. I want to go back to one thing you said, though, which was the sort of how to avoid the talking heads. My favorite way of putting this is the sort of mass Zoominar, right? Where you have an information session, it's one person talking over a PowerPoint. In the worst case scenario, they're just reading the PowerPoint text to you. And it's essentially just talking about why this university is great and you should apply to it. And counselors and students are getting have probably gotten hundreds of invitations to these sessions with little sort of customization, personalization, or localization as to the platform, the message, et cetera. And I think the real question that we've been struggling with is what is the best way that we can comfortably and safely, and meaningfully preserve some element of interactivity in a prospective or an admitted student event. So Sean, we've seen tons of tools, approaches, platforms in the last year that have sort of emerged as alternatives to that mass Zoominar of talking heads. Which ones, on the ground in Beijing, which ones have seemed the most promising to you? What are some sort of technical barriers that Chinese students in particular are facing? Which of these platforms or of these online virtual fair platforms or tools, are there any that are definitely blocked, kind of work intermittently? What's your sense of, can you walk us through sort of like what are the tools in the toolkit, and what are some examples of some ways that we can preserve that level of interaction that we might have had with a live Q&A session?
Yeah, sure. So from our previous experiences working with universities, we constantly get complaint or question about why their online sessions get really low attendance from the Chinese student. So the reason mainly because Zoom is kind of working in China, but they don't allow new registrations. So it's only people who already have a Zoom account to log in to Zoom and join the webinar or join any of the Zoom meetings. So also the connection of Zoom is constantly on and off. So it's not really stable for the Chinese audience. And the other thing is the Chinese student, they constantly get like many like information about the webinar. So sometimes they might get tiring to join like certain online events and hearing about the same kind of content. So we've seen some other platforms that will be really useful for Chinese students. Sometimes we will encourage our university partners to use Zoom, which is like a equivalence to we encourage the university to use Zhumu, which is the equivalent to Zoom. So it's like a localized app that student or parents, they can easily use or access in China. We will also recommend them to use some platform like Weikajiang or Xiaoetong, which is very WeChat friendly. They can easily share the link through a WeChat, and they don't have to download anything in order to enter a live streaming. Sometimes we've also seen people use Douyin live streaming to do like a live Q&A session to answer the questions from students and parents. But the only downside from Douyin live streaming is like you have to register a Douyin account and then verify your account before you start any live streaming. As you know, the China is really strict about the live streaming rules. So we've also seen some virtual expos. There are basically two kinds of virtual expos. One is just like a simple, like a list of Zoom rooms which you can enter, and it's like pretty basic. And the other one is actual VR expo, where student can have like a virtual avatar, and then having the view, when they walk close to avatar, they can just instantly start a conversation or a video call. So I would say these platforms are really good alternatives to do the information sharing for university. But on the other side, some platforms do have registration, some restrictions about what people can join or how you can verify your account before you actually run the event.
Yeah, so I think that generally speaking, when we see those virtual fairs, which are either, the Zoom Fun Mirror rooms, essentially just an amalgamation of Zoom rooms, a video game-like setup with an avatar and then a pop-up video, or even a fully, sort of immersive VR experience. The thing that we kind of notice is that the virtual fairs that we have seen that have been well attended have generally been run by companies focusing specifically on the China market and have used and selected a platform that is locally based. And it's been our experience that platform providers in, say, India or in other large sending markets that are eager to get other international participation, they do okay in other territories, but when they try to get in Chinese students into these activities or events, the students report that there are connectivity issues unless they have VPN, and VPN throttles your VPN or your internet connection. So even if you have a VPN, which is rare, the quality of the experience is weaker. Our opinion on this, my recommendation would be try as many things as you can and see what works for you, and certainly don't stop having private Zoom webinars, but just use a local platform and consider tailoring the content and even the title of that session to a particular audience, to a particular school or group of schools, to counselors or students or agents in one city. Make it feel a little bit more like you're still coming to them, just like you would at a school visit or at a fair where you would say, it's great to be here in Guiyang or something like that. Give the audience, something that sort of shows that this isn't just generic template. We do this every week, but we actually thought about who you are, and that's why you should come to us. But before we move on to the legal regulation stuff, Jorge and Lawrence, anything else that you guys would like to share as far as interesting sort of techniques on Zoom-like contexts or tools or platforms you guys are really liking?
Not necessarily on the tool or platform, but maybe on the technique. Adding to a little bit of what Lawrence was sharing about getting faculty more engaged. One of our strategies this year, which started as a pilot last year, it has been to create and deliver our own faculty-led interactive sessions, workshop-like sessions that are several hour-long sessions with current Iowa State University students participating, breakout rooms, exercises, special guests by the associate dean and the dean. So a very well thought and put program. We are still running a couple of those. We have 8 of those this year. We ran 2 pilots last year, and that is where we have found the meaningful interaction with the students. Whereas the regular, not every virtual fair, but some of the regular virtual fairs, most of the students are not sharing their videos through the meetings. At these events, at these workshop-like events, most of them are, and that is something that we haven't seen anywhere in the world. So starting there and building that's giving them an Iowa State University experience without any admissions component, because it has no admissions component first, and then connecting with them saying, hey, if you want to learn more about the university, I can schedule a one-on-one or whatever with your school. That has proven to be successful for us this year, and moving forward, we plan on continuing and expanding on that.
Yeah, and one other thing I guess just to segue on that is, particularly in the high school context, a lot of the time a counselor might be able to arrange a session for you where you might be speaking to a group of students, but many times, particularly in Chinese private schools, the students aren't allowed to have phones on them during the session. So it is really important to make sure that you're clear with the counselor on how the students can express interest in your university. Ideally, that's not just printing and mailing out a QR or listing your email and hoping they write it down and follow up, because after all, they're high school students. The chances that they'll do that are pretty low. And that's one thing that at the webcasts, a prospective student webcast that Sunrise puts on, that's one thing that we kind of view as critically important, is making sure that of all the people you spoke to, you're able to follow up with as many of them as possible. But yeah, anything else that you guys would like to add before we move on to the regulation stuff? Okay, sounds good then. So I'll go ahead and reshare my screen. The next section is some insight on what's happening with this new private tutoring law that you may have heard about that came out in China in July. So there's actually 2 laws. First is this tutoring law. That's the one that caused New Oriental and Tao and Gaotu stock to plummet. You guys might have seen that, because it might have actually caused your stock portfolio to go down somewhat, because a lot of investment firms invest in these companies. So this was announced on July 24th. It went into effect immediately, and there's basically pilot implementations going on in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, but it's being left up to local authorities to actually implement the law. Essentially, the core of it is that it dramatically limits the ability of private companies to offer core academic subject tutoring for grades 1 through 9 students. A core academic subject does include English, and so that's for grades 1 through 9 students. You also have a separate law that was introduced in May, went into effect about a week ago, regulating private schools. The big takeaway or impact is that essentially it makes it harder to open a private K-12 school, and it limits foreign ownership and the use of foreign curricula in primary and middle schools. So the policy shifts that probably matter the most for universities are that tutoring companies that operate in this space, so academic subjects in grades 1 through 9, they're all going to be converted into NGOs. They cannot pursue IPOs, they can't take investment of any kind, and they can't run classes on weekends or school holidays. Online tutoring companies can't hire foreigners outside of China to teach, and these companies and schools that focus on compulsory education years, so grade 1 through 9 students in those core subjects cannot use foreign curricula. And private schools also have to bring some of their enrollment practices for primary and middle years more in line with the way that enrollment and admission works for primary and middle schools in the public system. So some takeaways for universities are that first, this does not directly impact the ability of a private company to offer study overseas consulting, private admissions counseling, anything like that. That is still legal. None of that changes. However, there are some knock-on effects that we expect will sort of weaken the position of particularly large companies. In particular, we think that New Oriental may be in for a bit of a contraction, and that will open up some more space for private tutorers, what we call in Chinese 工作室, or sort of studio or very small size agencies or independent counselors. It'll also free up a little bit more breathing room for in-school counselors to occupy a little bit more of the conversation. For universities, one thing that you probably need to keep an eye on, currently Duolingo is blocked in China because English is a core academic subject and they don't require that you give your birth date or block grades 1 through 9 students. So they are, technically, there is a level on which they're not compliant. So they have been removed from all app stores in China, and you cannot go to their website right now. So if your website of your admissions process calls for students to do the Duolingo test of English, it is important that you keep a close eye on this. Duolingo is saying that this is really just to do with the content moderation, like the actual words and examples they use in their lessons, and they will be creating basically a China version of the app that meets different government sort of requirements as far as the content. It's hard to say how long it will take them to do that. And it's hard to say how quickly the Chinese government will then turn off the blockage, right? Particularly because you've got sort of the website access, which is government controlled, but then you've got private companies that govern and control the Chinese app stores like Apple, Xiaomi, and Huawei. So if this matters for your admissions process, if you still have students who are reporting issues in accessing TOEFL or IELTS, or if you saw a big uptick in Duolingo test takers, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. It might not matter by the time that your application due date happens, but it could. Also, new international school openings are probably going to start to slow down just because it's a lot harder to open a new school. Investors are kind of scared off a little bit, and foreign investors are locked out. So that does mean that you're probably going to see the stakes of any given individual relationship with a counselor probably go up because there won't be quite as large of a crop of newly opened schools. You can probably expect to see some pretty stressed out counselors in 2021 and 2022 because what exactly a foreign curriculum isn't very clearly defined. We expect that particularly if it remains difficult to get into China, if any of their colleagues have left the school, then they may have to just do more work with fewer people. So a lot of, the big question, I suppose, is why? A lot of the sort of government announcements and sort of government sort of documents out there explaining why this is going on really refer to China's demographic crisis. So China's birth rate is quite low. China went from having a 1-child policy to a 2-child policy, now to a 3-child policy, and birth rates really haven't gone up in the last 10 years. So this is a problem because the public pension system is probably going to be insolvent by 2035 if at the current pace. And there's also some big sort of economic problems when you have a contracting workforce and a large number of people who are dependent on entitlements. Also keeping in mind that China has a retirement age of 55, which means that people go on that system even earlier. However, despite the targeting of foreign curricula, this is really not a foreigner-focused set of laws. The reason for that is that if you look at all the schools in China, about 35% of them are private schools. However, of all the schools in China, 0.18% of them are international schools of some form or variety. So we're really dealing with a very, very small slice. And even within that very small slice, the private international schools that fall under this new law aren't even that entire slice. So most of these new regulations focus on domestically focused private schools or domestically focused tutoring companies. You can see here that there's more than 201,000 private tutoring companies in China, and nationwide, there's about 17,000 companies that offer some service relevant to study overseas. and most of those companies that only do study overseas just aren't going to fall if they're not offering math tutoring for ninth graders. However, companies like, say, New Oriental, they have many business units that live inside of one center, and it may be that one center just can't, only servicing high school students and working with students on extracurricular activities rather than core subjects just isn't enough revenue to keep the center open. So you may see that that the sort of large chain store agencies lose some depth, or some of their centers close and consolidate. So because the regulations are being enforced in such different ways between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities, we're already seeing this, for instance, if you compare Shanghai, where enforcement is very, very robust and strict, with a place like Hainan, where essentially a lot of newly opened schools are kind of, authorities are turning a blind eye to them because there's still a quite strong interest in getting more international schools open in the province. So we're seeing basically another fissure along which tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities and regional differences like north-south, coastal and inland places in China differ. So this is just one extra variable along which places in China can differ. So let's abstract away from that and kind of back away. I'd like to ask everyone, how does your institution approach different tiers or regions of China in different ways? So what are some examples of ways that you might talk to students in, say, Qingdao that might be different from a big city like Beijing? Are you seeing a broader trend towards more applications from tier 2 and tier 3 cities and fewer from tier 1 cities?
So I would like to share some for this question. So from our previous experiences, students from tier 1 city, they normally would spend more time on their classes, basically. But then with the China implementing a new online gaming restriction, that will also affect the children or teenagers who are under 18-year-old to be able to only play computer games for 1 hour during the weekends. And they're not allowed to play the online games during the weekdays. So with that being said, I think more students will spend more time on the social media, which means they will also spend more time searching for content, interesting content on the social media. So I think it's really important for university to really emphasize their digital presence in China, not only the localized Chinese website, but also focus on the Chinese social media. I think for big universities who already have some sort of digital presence, it's important to build a community and to build the close connection with your prospective student and parents. And for smaller university or LAC, I think it's time to consider for a Chinese website to really have your content that can be understood by the Chinese parents, especially for the parents from the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. They are normally they don't really read English characters for those parents. So it's really important for them to understand your materials so that because eventually they're the decision maker for their children to make a decision when they apply for universities. So I think for the people or students or parents in the tier 2 or tier 3 cities, it's really important to have those digital presence to really have your information can be understood by those audience.
Yeah, so students spending less time cramming in private tutoring centers may ironically result in them playing on social media more and thus be a bit more exposed to perhaps messages or ads from universities, which is a sort of interesting, perhaps unintended consequence. But Lawrence and Jorge, any thoughts on, abstracting away from the nuts and bolts of this particular law? Any thoughts on sort of the trends you're seeing in, geographically in China? Are you seeing more students from tier 2 and tier 3 cities? And do you sort of differentiate your message or approach in a significant way between those students?
Yeah, for us, again, we're a business school within a university. So we've strategically targeted to increase our representation of students from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. That 5 years ago, the vast majority of our Chinese students were from tier 1 cities. And when we were looking to diversify our student population in general, one of them was, how do we diversify China? And one dimension of that was trying to recruit more from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So for us, the messaging is essentially the same. How it's delivered is a little bit different. We actually have a few assets in China and all throughout China, but we focus those boots on the ground assets in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where it's more important, at least in my opinion, it's more important to have FaceTime, physical FaceTime if possible, to help tell our story. Those boots on the ground also serve as coordinators of we have an alumni ambassador program. And again, we've now grown significant numbers of students who've come from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So now we have a sizable alumni group from the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And so our alumni ambassadors and some of our other part-time assets actually help coordinate engagements between prospective students and those alumni ambassadors. So again, the messages are, for the most part, fairly similar. We do a lot more outreach, even at the graduate level, with parents in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So we have for example, this past year before the sort of mini lockdowns, we did coffee chats when it was appropriate, and did small group coffee chats with one of our on the ground staff members, alumni ambassadors, and then prospective students and their parents. Parents are actively involved, as you all know, sort of across the life cycle of their students' educational pursuits. So parents are definitely a factor even in the graduate space.
And one other sort of final question, and before we get into it, I'll invite the audience, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to hear them. Feel free to use the Q&A tool, and that'll give us a second to kind of sort through the questions that we want to get to in the remaining time. But my final question was, given that it's possible or foreseeable that these laws and some of the broader changes that we're seeing in China might result in a decentralization of the agency space, agents might take up a little bit less of the oxygen in the room, making a little bit more room for independent counselors, in-school counselors, SMEs, these sorts of things. Perhaps, I think that it's likely that direct campaigns to students and to families from universities will matter more, as opposed to simply having agents do a lot of that sort of on the ground coordination and outreach to families. So are there any examples of particular messages for campaigns that either of your universities or Sean, any I guess examples of copy that we've created that you think are particularly effective, or particularly effective for a particular tier of city or something like that? I know we had touched on Fordham Ford and Gabelli Ford, but yeah, if there are any other examples of campaigns that and messaging that you found to be effective, we'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, so the messages that we previously created for our university partners get the most views are those really related to the students or the current student or the alumni. So we recently created a really popular or interesting message for University of Oregon right after the Olympics. So we actually found an article about the student from University of Oregon who participate in the Olympics. So we instantly translate the article and localize and post it on WeChat. And because of the news about Tokyo Olympics, and that post also instantly get like a really good number of views during that time. And some other posts that we did for our partners are student related. So we would really want to include more student stories or alumni stories on their social media. So one important thing is for prospective student or for parents, they really would love to hear more aspect or point of view from other people instead of just university being the only one narrative. So we try to include the stories of their Chinese alumni or their current Chinese student. For example, we will ask them to like do a campaign to showcase their one-day experience at the university, so that a prospective student or the parents can have a really clear understanding of how the life is at the university, especially during the COVID time. You're muted,
So
David.
Sorry, thank you, quote of 2020. I see some questions trickling in. Before we get to those, anything else that you'd like to add, Jorge or Lawrence, before we do Q&A?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that one of the aspects that Iowa State is most excited about our partnership with Sunrise is that on top of that we're building our website in China with Sunrise and all of these different social media platforms, and that Sunrise is not only building but managing. Sunrise is creating original content for us and localizing our existing content for China. You asked about specific messaging that we're using for tier 1, tier 2. I can't answer that question. That's why we're partnering with you guys so that you guys can help us create that content that's going to work in that specific market.
Definitely. Well, thank you for the shout out. Yeah, that completely makes sense. So in terms of questions that I've seen come in, I have a couple that I think I can just address really briefly. So first, Catherine asks, with regard to vaccination requirements for travel into China, what vaccines are being accepted for non-Chinese nationals, and what is the impact on travel to the country and recruitment? So just to be clear, even if you are vaccinated, unless you have a Chinese-made vaccine, so Sinovac, Sinopharm, these are generally viral vector vaccines. Unless you've got a Chinese-made vaccine, China will not recognize that vaccine for the purposes of applying for a visa. Now, if you happen to already have a Chinese visa, like you've gotten one after March of 2020, if you have an active non-canceled Chinese visa, China will also ask you to send in proof of your health status, right? So that proof that you're not sick, like a negative COVID stats. They will accept a US vaccine for the purposes of demonstrating that you are not sick, but that will not, you will still need a PU letter in order to enter China, and they're not giving PU letters right now. The only workaround to getting that PU letter is to have a Chinese-made vaccine. Chinese vaccines are not FDA approved, and they are not available in the United States. I have heard of some English teachers flying to the Dominican Republic and getting the Chinese shot and then going to China. I'm not sure I'd recommend that. Data's kind of, jury's out on how effective the Chinese vax is against Delta variant. So the vaccines really will not, the Chinese visa or entry restrictions are agnostic essentially to your visa status unless you've got a Chinese vaccine. The Chinese vaccines are available in Serbia and Bahrain and some places like that, but nowhere very close, unfortunately. So the next question I see is, are online graduate programs becoming popular in China? And 2, is TikTok a popular method of reaching Chinese students? So I can take number 2, that's pretty easy. So TikTok is called TikTok outside of China. Inside China, it's essentially a very similar app, just with different content called Douyin, but it's owned by the same company, ByteDance. So TikTok is censored in China, ironically, even though it's a Chinese product. But Douyin is quite popular. Number of our clients maintain Douyin accounts. They're really effective. The cost per click on advertising on Douyin is quite inexpensive. You do need to go through a verification process, which will require a local partner or having a local office, an entity. But yes, Douyin is growing in popularity. Just like TikTok, it is a time suck. I spend more time than I'm comfortable admitting on TikTok, and I think most students would confess to the same. I'd like to turn it around to the panel. What's your experience marketing or promoting online graduate programs in China? Is that really on people's radar? And I suppose maybe there's two answers. One that's sort of like on graduate programs that have always been online and graduate programs that are temporarily online or hybrid.
We have, again, I represent a business school within the university. We have several online master's programs, and we actually haven't seen, I think we may have thought that there would have been a little bit of an uptick in international, regardless of whether it's China or other places. But we really haven't seen an uptick in international interest in our online full degree programs. However, we are seeing an uptick in interest in our non-degree programs. So our certificates and boot camps and badges, we are seeing an uptick in interest from international students, China included, in those non-degree types of activities.
And the next question we got was, how did your schools work through, or thank you so much for in regards to traveling and studying in the US right now. So how has your school worked through those conversations with Chinese parents in particular? So I suppose the question really is, there's, I think, this perception that traveling to the US is expensive because there's not many flights available. And perhaps there's more so than in 2019 concerns about gun violence, issues of racism, and the Black Lives Matter protests were quite extensively covered, as well as the sort of January riots in the U.S. I think that safety is this concept of safety among students and parents. People are a little bit more cognizant of that, particularly because as parents consider questions of safety, they're also thinking about numbers of infections in the US, numbers of hospitalizations, capacity at ICUs. The US is quite transparent about this, but the numbers are scary. So have there been particular ways of reassuring parents that your community is different from those national average statistics in the United States? And what's kind of been the experience of talking parents through those questions? Has it gotten better, or has it gotten worse since the early days of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question. So has it gotten better or worse? It's actually about the same. So we're smack dab in the middle of Manhattan, and while everybody wants to come to Manhattan, there's always been this in the backdrop, there's always been this question about safety for quite some time. I'm sending my student halfway around the world to the big New York City. It's fantastic. You've got Times Square and Wall Street, but we also heard of all this, the other things about people getting mugged and things like that. So for safety, like we've always had we actually have a communication that goes right to parents. Again, we do communicate with parents of prospective graduate students, and it talks about safety. It's pretty high level, but we try to be as transparent as possible. So when the pandemic hit, and then we started to have more airtime because these things have existed for quite some time, but it was definitely more in the media and sort of in the front of our heads around Black Lives Matter movements, especially in big cities like New York and San Francisco, the Asian American crime, the hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Americans, Pacific Islanders. So it's about over communicating and being very transparent. I know a couple of my colleagues, I've talked to them, and they tried to sort of spin it in certain ways. There's no need to spin it. It is what it is. We live in an age where people can fact check you in a heartbeat. So there's no need to try to put any sort of differential spin on it. Just be honest and upfront, and try to answer the questions as open and honest and as candidly as possible.
Definitely, that makes sense, and I think that it's really important to over communicate and to use every sort of channel of communicating to students and parents, so that if they're getting information that's of questionable quality. At the very least, you've got sort of, the better information, directly from the source available to them. Final question was from Matt, asking if there's been any interest in course delivery format among Chinese students. So either a fully online remote program or a local study option through a Chinese university partner for those interested in getting a US degree. And if so, is anyone expecting that would continue beyond the COVID era? My personal sort of take on this is that a lot of these sort of local delivery options, if you sort of look at the nuts and bolts of how they work, aren't so different from how many inter-university partnerships or dual degree programs in Chinese universities worked before the pandemic. You just saw more universities establish temporary partnerships or student villages or remote campuses in partnership with the Chinese university. I think that we may see some of those partnerships persist. I think that all things equal, unless there is a significant difference in the price of tuition, I think that for students being able to live in the United States, particularly in a place that has attractive weather, is in a big city, where they feel like there's opportunities for good networking or finding employment either for OPT or in the long term. If they feel like those benefits are there and it's going to cost the same price, then I think that for many students post-COVID, I do think you'll have sort of a whiplash of students wanting to will overwhelmingly prefer offline. Now, on the other hand, if there is significant cost savings involved, particularly for a university for whom tuition is on the higher end of the spectrum, then I think that a local option is significantly less expensive. Then I think that does change the equation in a significant way. I think that for a lot of students, it will come down to a question of what value do they perceive, and if the price is the same, then what countervailing extra services or other benefits does that locally based program offer in comparison? But that's just my 2 cents. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I think that students want to come to the U.S. Because they want the experience. And I guess if the cost is the same, you do have to think about what are those other things on the fringe that have high value. And I think that there still is very much a desire. Again, we're still dealing with many Chinese students that are maybe not first generation college students, but first generation going to the US. And I recognize that this is a big deal to have your child spend some time at an academic institution abroad. May not be in the US, it could be in other parts of the world. So I think that will still be very influential in the decision to what type of modality. But I do think that we're going to see, even post-COVID, students that are potentially pairing maybe a local university experience or semi-local university experience with non-degree things from international universities. So again, we've already started to see some of that. Like in COVID, we had a lot of students who deferred and then ended up not coming at all for our full degree programs, but definitely are taking advantage of some of our non-degree options. So they're enrolled in a local university, but they're taking advantage of, for example, one of our certificate programs, which is credit bearing, but it's not a full degree program, and it includes a global immersion here in New York City for 10 days. So next summer, these students will do that. They're going to get their degree from their local or semi-local or regional university there in Asia, but they're also coupling that with this experience with us. And then they will come on campus for 10 days, come to New York City for 10 days. So they kind of get the best of both worlds.
And I think we're seeing a lot of innovation in the education technology industry in this sort of space of micro-credentialing. So this kind of used to be referred to as just coding boot camp or something, but it's sort of been brought into many more things, from business analytics to business English to many other things. So I think that as we see that trend continue to accelerate, I think that that's, I think that it's plausible that that's more so the future of those sort of hybridized experiences where students are mixing and matching and, maybe saving a significant amount of money in tuition if they're only studying overseas for, for a shorter amount of time. I think that those tend to scaffold more directly onto particular career paths. So I do think as you promote those programs to Chinese students, it's important to be aware of what career opportunities exist inside the Chinese market for students who might get that credential. If there are big name companies that you're able to form relationships with, and just get their HR departments aware of who you are and what programs you offer, that can be really helpful. So before we wrap up, just one last thing, a couple of next steps and recommendations and resources for everyone. We encourage everyone to join our LinkedIn group. It's a discussion group fairly active on different trends and bits of news in the Chinese education space. Obviously, we're happy to schedule a call to talk to you about your recruitment goals or just answer any particular questions you have about engaging the Chinese market. If that's just a fact-finding mission, we're happy to chat with you and share our 2 cents. We also have, speaking of virtual events, we have lots of student webcasts that are being done for graduate schools, undergraduate programs, targeting tier 2 and tier 3 cities, trying to kind of get over the hump of that challenge of not just being talking heads in a mass seminar setting. Next, we would encourage you to consider having a full-time or a seasonal in-country representative. This can sound like a pretty huge upfront commitment because you're hiring someone and you don't know how long the pandemic is going to be lasting. So, what does that mean from a sort of HR, from a legal perspective? Well, now Sunrise is one player that is now offering either full-time or seasonal or part-time representatives who can essentially fill in for you in, for a particular event or a particular tour, so that you're able to have boots on the ground, but you might not, sort of carry the same, responsibilities for, conducting, that come with hiring someone full-time. And we also help out with questions to do with payroll and legal compliance. You do have to be registered in China in order to pay people's taxes and take care of social security and healthcare contributions and all that. So that's one new tool in the toolkit that we offer. So that way, if alumni reps aren't just you feel like there's kind of an incongruence or inconsistency between having alumni reps represent you at a fair or an event and what you're comfortable with, this is one other option available to you. And then finally, we'd encourage you to have a look at our other white papers. You're probably here because you downloaded the white paper on the Chinese tutoring law. We do also have 2 other white papers, one on the K-12 sector in China, growth of international schools, as well as another piece on that's a sort of comprehensive wrap up of China's digital platforms, be those search, social, and things that sort of straddle the boundary. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and for the thoughtful questions. Thank you so much, Lawrence, and belatedly Jorge for joining us. Appreciate your joining us as well, Keating. And Shan, thank you so much. Please get some sleep. Huge thank you to Shan for toughing it out now at 3 a.m. here in Beijing. With that said, I hope everyone has a productive start to the fall semester. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a nice day.